Yep.
James, are we ready? The upstairs is also open if you need that. Okay, everybody, we're gonna get started while people are taking their seats, and welcome you to the afternoon session of the sequence here on Monday with Pliny Fisk, and it's all about the Muncie River. To those of you who might be coming in on the webcast for the first time today, welcome. We're glad you're with us, and look forward to your comments on Twitter or tweet. I think we have a site that you can, is that right, Simon? Can Twitter in on?
John, pointer?
Okay. Let me introduce Pliny Fisk again. He's here from Austin, Texas. He runs a nonprofit that is called the Center for Maximum Potential Building Systems. It's on the net, cmpbs.org. They have been instrumental in the green movements for probably 30 years or more. They do education, they do project development, they do repair, they do hurricane, they do everything. They're very happy to have Pliny here working with his favorite students, the students of Ball State. So with that, Pliny Fisk is going to take us through the lenses this afternoon, and then we're going to break around 2 o'clock. Is that right, John? For going into the studios and carrying on from there.
So, how many of you were not here this morning? Fascinating. So, everybody knows what a kaleidoscope is? Good. Does everybody know it, if you've been to the optometrist office, that you have this crazy gadget that puts lenses in front of lenses until you can actually see something? I guess none of those people that have glasses have ever done this, but so that's a problem. But at least you know what a kaleidoscope is. So we're going to make believe that these lenses are ways of looking at design, the future. Depending on what lenses you put in front of you, makes things clearer. Or, in some cases, blurry, so you have to get another lens. In some cases, one lens doesn't do it, 2 lenses don't do it, 3 lenses don't do it, so you've got to bring in 4 lenses till things become focused. So on the bottom of every one of these pages, there are all kinds of what we call our prototypes. And they are all connected to that lens because someplace in the overlay within each one of these lenses, which you can't quite see because it's blurry. Is that the slide, or is that the projector, or is that me? Maybe I need new glasses. Anyway, these are overlays. And so in every one of those projects, that lens somehow exists. And you're going to be doing the extraordinary thing of choosing some of these lenses for representing what you're going to be doing on the White River. And we're going to be going over the White River enough in a sort of meta-level way of thinking that you're going to get some idea how these lenses relate to a particular project. So I'm going to go over, once I get that pointer, which does anybody have a pointer in the audience? Nobody. Cool. No, John is getting one, but For me to start, I need something. Beautiful. Really? Well, I'm more used to this, I think. Which one does it? Is it the laser? Do you see anything? I can see a dot. You can see the dot? Oh, there's a tiny dot. Oh my goodness. Oh. New battery needed. Oh well, John is bringing another one. Well, I'm going to direct you to the lower left. Oh, what? What's going on? Oh, cool. I'm going to collect all these up here pretty soon. So which one? The red one?
Sort of like right there.
This one. Perfect. Let's talk about that. So I like to go through these things not with a bunch of images, but a little bit more with some stories. So everybody knows about what Formula One is? Racing car. So Formula One has hit Austin, Texas. So all the environmentalists, my friends, fought it. And my attitude, good luck, guys. It's going to happen. So if you make believe it's going to happen and how you can begin to leverage it, you begin to think of things maybe in a different way. That maybe this extraordinary amount of money and commotion about Formula One might be beneficial. So this, believe it or not, try that again. Oh, man. Jeez. This is unbelievable. That one. Is an aspirating shaft. Does anybody know what an aspirating shaft is? Does anybody know that chimney that's out here not too far away that all the smoke comes out of? An aspirating shaft, when you get it heated, it actually produces a draft. The height is extremely important. So I looked at the plan for the racetrack and I said, you know, there are a bunch of light poles, big light poles. Smallest one, 77 foot tall. And then I could retrofit those light poles with a black, flexible photovoltaic panel, a sock going all the way down. And because it was black, it would create a draft. And because it was a photovoltaic panel, it would make electricity. And if I had a filter on the bottom of this, I could clean the air at those points where air is the most serious, low points on the track. And out the top, I'd have these lungs in every situation producing clean air, and meanwhile being paid for by, can't see it on this one, Porsche, Ferrari. So this is a proposal sitting at this very moment in front of the Formula One committee. So I use biological life in a filter on the bottom to filter all the bad stuff in that air. And the bottom of the filter for the draining of the water, because what else happens at that bottom point? Water drainage. All the cadmiums, all the heavy metals in the brakes, all the petroleum is going right down the drain and usually right into the river. Now, some people would call this a living machine. And you're most familiar with living machines only, unfortunately, related to wastewater treatment. So you have a bunch of plants in a tank. You treat the wastewater with plants and sun before the water leaves. But I will say that there are many living machine possibilities. I can go up here and I can go into many other possibilities. That's a bat tower. So what do bats do? They get insects. What do they also do? They produce the best fertilizer known on the planet. You know what's sort of serious, however? Like the cadmiums and all the bad stuff coming off that track, the most serious combination of chemicals that are going on in the environment are all happening typically in the typical backyard that people live in. So all the chemical fertilizers, the pesticides, the herbicides, and everything all come together in a confluence of a biologically terrible soup of toxins, to the point that you have 34 toxins in a typical backyard in the United States. So we produce a living machine using bats to treat the insects, to take that fertilizer, collect it, and put it into the landscape. So I'm using life forms, again, in this case, bats, to actually correct a fairly serious situation that is so serious that it makes our agriculture, chemicals and fertilizers, look fairly tame. So one of the things that begins to happen as you get into these lenses, you begin to say, oh, shit. Not only because we're talking about shit very often, but you say, oh, shit, because of the issue. And a lot of those issues are squarely into the knowledge base of this group of people, or could be. I certainly can't talk about living machines to architects. They don't understand anything I'm talking about. Now, in each one of these things, you could begin to imagine. Let's say that I take this and I say I leverage these crazy Formula One people that have been fought against and so on, and I look at the city. And I look at intersections. And I begin to realize, wow, people are standing there, people are about to cross the street, and people are at the absolute worst situation where cars stop and start. And what happens when you start and stop? The engines are the most inefficient, and all the pollution is happening right there where people are. And when they stop, all the cadmiums and everything come off the brakes, and where does it go? Down underneath where people stand, in the drain. So wouldn't it be interesting if there were a whole series of these ways of beginning to think about how you retrofit and use that lens and maybe some other lenses that we'll be talking about to actually change big problems, big breathing problems, big urban problems. So these are fairly small, they're fairly innocuous, but they're big in consequence. And the interesting thing is there are lots of lamps around. There are lamps everywhere, of every size and dimension that you can possibly imagine. And we have realized that with good, efficient light, LEDs, powerful, that we can actually power the lights and do these other things. So I've got energy, I've got water, I've got air, I got air balance, water balance, energy balance, all going on in a single retrofit. I can keep going. Every one of these things have certain kinds of protocols, and you'll have these handed out to you, so that as you begin to work on things over this week, you'll say, oh, I'm beginning to understand how to do that. But even the concept at this point in time is important, because you're in a role in the world that can begin to not only design these things, but I will be pushing the possibility of all sorts of business opportunities. Not just sitting there behind a desk being a good landscape architect, but, you know, maybe going the next step, saying, hey, there are various things that I'm doing that are such important products that I can be part of an economic system that is very desperately needed many places across the United States. Let's take this one. So we're going to have more information on that as well. It's called a living bridge. So it's very interesting. Just like the other two, bridges are bad. Bad situation. Bridges come along and they pay no attention to rivers. All the animals and all the creatures that try to sneak in are eradicated. They're saying, oh, can't do that. Animal species, bird species, all kinds of things, even human species, gather under the bridges. Bad stuff. What happens if you reversed it? What happens if you began to say, bridge, wow, bridge could support life. Bridges could be made to attract species, to attract habitat, to attract people actually being able to get closer to and observe and connect to the living system around the bridge. In fact, the living bridge could be a trigger to the ecosystem in that particular subsystem of the river, the stream bed, whatever it happens to be, or the river itself. Or you could get really outrageous. And go full bore. Now again, you know, I don't care whether you're an industrial designer, a landscape designer, an architecture designer, a planner type designer, city planner, regional planner, whatever. These things become what Donella Meadows in systems theory sense says, this triggers all sorts of possibilities. So here's another living bridge. So, polluted river. So John and Jody and I are going to go through the various aspects of the White River corridor, and you're going to begin to see where are the most serious pollution situations going on. Where are the most serious entrances to Muncie over a bridge that pays absolutely no attention to the river. Certainly not wildlife. Can't see the river. It's actually blocked by how the bridge is designed. You'd have to be on the rail to look down to see what is going on with the river. This is not what you call respectful for a major spine and corridor going through your city. It's turning your back on it. Make believe it doesn't exist. So now down at the other end, though, we got all this pollution stuff going on. So you got this joyful situation where all that water and all those intersections is joining the sewage. So you've got a combined flow situation that ends up at the lower part of Muncie being all collected to the point that you don't even want to touch the water. So there's no one way of connecting to this. There are multiple ways, and so I think, well, maybe there's another kind of a bridge. Maybe there's a bridge that actually stays underwater. And it's not until people come along and they press a button and the bridge has this unbelievable force of water and a little bit of oxygen pumping down on a slab of concrete that goes the full length of the width of the river and just mesmerizes that water with oxygen. And at the same time, lots of commotion. Fog. Commotion happening all around this thing. And people say, whoa, there's sensors that tell us in the river how bad it is. And when this bridge goes way up with a lot of force, says, damn, that river is in bad shape. So it visually connects. It solves a little bit of a problem in an interesting way. And then you begin to say, all right, well, what is it made of? What's the bridge made of? Now, so I switch. I go up to this one. Embodied carbon balance. So this bridge that we designed for a very particular place south of Austin, with a very important corridor going up through and underneath it, all out of wood. So everybody says, wood? How do you possibly go and get anybody in this world to actually approve a bridge these days made out of wood? This was 150 years ago. These crazy covered bridges up in Vermont. Can't do that. Won't pass. In Texas, you do have a real problem with it passing. You know why you have a problem? You got a huge lobby called the concrete industry that makes believe and thinks that every bridge on the entire state of Texas is going to be cement. So you have to make a little bit of friends with these guys and say, hey, you know, we can carbon balance your cement by how we do a bridge that is combined. So we do the life cycle of the wood species and the wood preservation and everything that we're using in this bridge. And what we do is that we use it as formwork that becomes possibly sacrificial. And instead of disassembling all the formwork, we actually leave it. And when we leave it, the core of the bridge, it might be the cement going through, is to be carbon balanced, because the amount of carbon stored in the wood is making up for the amount of carbon sitting in that concrete. Now one thinks, well, you know, this is a little bit hypothetical, there's no reality behind it. Until what I went over this morning were some woods that are preserved in such a way that are on the market that I can pick up the phone and get a truck here tomorrow, that for some odd reason, by mistake, the process of curing the wood made it 2.5 times the strength of normal wood. So there are lots of things beginning to happen here. Lots of very complicated stuff, and I'm not even through one lens yet. And I better get going, huh? I'm in trouble. Trouble already? Oh man, I can talk about a lens for weeks. Another lens. Shoot, I wanted to talk more about that. Well, okay, another lens. How do I change this thing? Nothing shows up. Help. I don't know how to change this thing. I pushed. Arrow, push, push, this one, that one. Push, push.
How about hitting return?
Return. There's a good one. It's interesting. For looking like and acting like a Back to the Future guy, I can't even get that doggone computer operating. That's right. Thank you very much. I've got an ally here. I can keep talking about this one because it doesn't change. So, I am very involved with what is the idea of a column. This column happens to be a very large column. It's 800 feet tall. Now, some of you say, this doesn't have anything to do with landscape architecture. And then I come up here this morning and I listen to the bell tower. And I ask Jody, well, where did the bell tower come from? Oh, a landscape architect designed that. Really? So you got bell towers around here that landscape architects are doing? Maybe a landscape architect could be involved with this 800-foot tall tower. And what's that 800-foot tall tower made out of? Carbon-balanced cement that comes from the water out of the ground that we treated to make it into good water that on the side happens to produce hydrogen. Now you're beginning to say, now this has nothing to do with landscape architecture. Sure, visible green. I can do any one of these, right? Visible green. 10 minutes on this one, and then the bell and the bell tower is going to ring. This is cool. So visible green. So we've got visible home, visible person. Almost got into that one. So is anybody connected to the internet in here right now? Everybody. Cool. Put in green goose. See what comes up. Green goose. So green goose enables your environment to communicate with you. They're little icons. In fact, if you work with green goose folks, they can help you design an icon that you're putting on whatever to lead you on a day-by-day basis into understanding how the environment around you is working. All of a sudden, the cycles that we went over this morning, the sourcing of things, the processing of things, the using of things, the resourcing of things, keeping the cycles going, they're beautiful information icons all around you that say, hey, you just used too much water this morning. The cistern, if you keep that up, the balance going on here, bad news. So now we're getting into inanimate objects, the world around you beginning to talk to you. Or since I see these things called QR codes around here, or tag codes, you can actually, unfortunately in a non-interactive sense, what I just went through is actual interaction. It's telling you something. It's connecting to you. It's saying, you know, the building or the bench or the park or the river or the bridge beginning to tell you something, in case you forgot. So is this some sort of weirdness beginning to happen? Or are you going to begin to say, cool, I can actually design things that people can understand, and that I can get feedback about things, and if they're not working, that I can go to the next level and I'm beginning to get feedback and learning happening? So I'm developing a media process and a communication process, and I'm conscious of this as I design. Excuse me, I think the water idea might be good. Maybe I take a sip of this. How well do we know each other?
Go for it.
Okay. Oh, man. I lost my thing here. So there are many sensors. There are many things that I could actually these days build into my design that talks to me. And more important than that, talks to the people that are about to use it. And as they begin to learn how to use it, and all the green projects in the White River corridor, of which I will submit there are many, many possibilities, could actually be interpreted in interesting ways. You don't need one of these old signs there. You need just a code, click in, wow. The reason that tree is being planted here is it actually can take flood. And by the way, it's stabilizing the bank. And by the way, there are 3 other good species that do this. And so that everyone is becoming a landscape architect. And they're beginning to understand things as well as you're beginning to understand them. And in fact, if you're lucky, some of those people are going to get back to you and say, hey, did you know about this species of willow that I planted 20 years ago? Been through extreme situations, and in fact, I have this outfall from my sewage system, and it's illegal. Don't tell anybody. But it loves that sewage. So all of a sudden I say, wow, cool. Somebody's getting back to me and teaching me something I knew nothing about. In no journal of landscape architecture tree identification book. When you get to that level of a learning environment, you're beginning to get much feedback. Don't you dare change that. Yet.
Okay.
I'm going to give me a minute, just a minute.
Another minute.
Okay. So here's an interesting project. So a developer comes along and says, you know, I like what you're doing. Cool stuff. What would happen if we developed a home that was resilient? Now, he didn't say that. That's my interpretation in my academic world of a resilient home. What is a resilient home? A resilient home begins to respond to this unbelievable situation in Texas that I explained this morning, where we have the most disasters of any state in the entire country. Every time I look around, it's either flood or fire or tornado or something. And I look at what's going on in housing and building of any structure, it's as though we're living in 1922. We're not preparing for the future. In fact, most of the time we're going backwards. So here this developer, I say, you know, it looks the same, guys, so you can sell the house. I call it a Trojan green horse. But hidden inside that horse, I can totally transform all the porches, how I think about the foundation, because why? I can support so much water collection in that building that that forest fire comes along, and I do a little bit of tweaking with that gutter. So the gutter gets out of the way. In fact, the gutter is so sophisticated that the water comes down, hits the back of the gutter, splashes against the walls, goes down, and where does it go down to? All those flower beds that happen to also treat the wastewater. So I've got one deterrent after another deterrent. I then go and use the cements that I will tell you about later on. And these cements are refractory cements that come out of the water that I'm processing from the well that's too salty that I can't use. Now I'm beginning to get systems of thinking going that are the most important ways of thinking about the landscape for the future. Is it just plants? Is it just materials? Is it just this or just that? It is a way of thinking about cycles of things. Next. Doesn't matter.
Anybody?
What do you want?
Huh?
Gamification. How about that one? So John and I, years ago, put what I still think is a recyclable proposal. So John is a fellow at our center. We've known each other and worked with each other to the point where it's almost like mental telepathy. I think of something, and John says, you know, I was thinking about the same thing. It's a little bit weird, actually, after a while. And so we said, wouldn't it be interesting to take the idea of games and ramp it up a bit? Because a lot of people will come into my place and they'll say, you know, you guys have too much fun. Every time I turn around, there's some wild project going on. And you got these interns. We've had interns from 56 universities. No advertising, except right now. It's about my advertising extent. We've had 10 excellent interns, by the way, from Ball State. So they're doing their projects. And then there's this weird television thing that goes on. You know, reality TV? They got a camera up there. You know, I'm not a reality TV fan, to be very honest with you, but it's amazing how many people look at this bullshit. And I say to myself, well, can't fight it. Let's go with it. Now, another weird thing that goes on in our place is that we grid ourselves. Everything is gridded. If I had a map of our entire 18 acres, we've gridded it. There are hidden places in the ground. You can find the point of the square. We use the Platte-Carré equal area system, which is one of the major 16 mapping techniques, projections. So our buildings are square. The landscape is square. It's hidden. But what goes on in one box related to the box next to it is being recorded and uploaded. And this idea of design build is being shared with other similar places in the world. So this went to the U.S. Department of Education, and it was ranked #1 in the country. We got the most extraordinary feedback saying this is the future of education. Because what we also did, we simultaneously said, you know, there's going to be a game part of this. So the reality of doing something and the feedback and the camera and connecting that to another green building operation in some other place in the world, university connected or not, where all these thousands and millions of nonprofits and NGOs that are doing all this great experimentation work, all of a sudden you're crowdsourcing. So the game becomes slowly viral, becomes similar region to similar region. It's a learning network. You're projecting things in the game. You're playing things in reality. Something didn't work. You're sharing it. You're connecting up. You're connecting down, sideways, backwards, and forwards. Now, there are many ways of doing things like this. But we do games in practically everything that we do. There's some version where we play. And what's the best way to learn? Play. Because you're being relaxed, you're absorbing things that otherwise being pushed at and being drummed at and down your throat does not work. So if you don't believe me, look at NSF, National Science. Oh no, it's not NSF. What's the big art group in the U.S.? NEA. So National Endowment for the Arts used to put lots of money into various programs that they don't put money into anymore. It's changed in the last year. And you know where much, much more money is going into? Educational games. So all you entrepreneurs out there that think, hey, where do I get money from? They're putting out millions. And some of you, like Chris, have been trying to do some of this kind of thing. It's another form of doing what I was doing with the visible green. But another venue, another lens, another expertise, another way of sieving through. So as we get into things, wouldn't it be interesting, as has been done with Minikrista, other things around here, that these games become more prevalent, and that you do the outrageous thing of actually having fun in the studio doing a game. Chris has been doing that. Where's Chris? Up there. Oh, there's a nut there. My goodness. Okay, next. Let's do protoscope. Oh, we did that already. I'm sorry. Metamax. Metamax. So Metamax says, you know, we got to go for it. There are such major issues going on that we have to somehow or other, even if it's a competition that we join, even if it's some outrageous process that we're getting out there to getting to the point where people are saying, whoa! So the first thing that I got into that began to say, whoa, was that I was brought to China on a delegation. You got these super greenies all together. You got the Chinese paralleling each one of us. Here's the Civil Engineering Research Institute out of Washington. Here's the RMI out of Colorado. I was the coordinator of the group. And what are we doing? We're trying to make the future farms interesting enough as a village in rural China with the Chinese so that farmers wanted to remain being farmers and not move into the urbanization. Not an easy task. But it was a cool situation. I mean, here the Chinese are up for inviting all these wild green people, invited directly by the governor, gone to the Department of Energy. Department of Energy selected us. There we are in China. So I happened to bring my atlas along, which I always do. I'm a map-crazy person. And I look at the map, and here we are in the middle of the sort of vegetable, huge vegetable region of China. All these mountains around. And we're sitting in this place, and I sort of look at my atlas, and I say, whoa, there's a lot of coal underneath this ground. And I look at the mayor over dinner, and I say, what are you going to do with the coal? And they say, oh, we're going to get it. So this is just an exercise in futility of some kind. We're just going to do this little exercise, going to make the world think you're really doing something cool, and in reality, you're going to destroy anything that we're doing. Well, I wouldn't go that far, Mr. Fisk. I said, but that's the reality. So I said, you know, I grew up in a compost pile. And I did. Our house was surrounded by compost. I had a nutty dad who did high-rate compost fertilizer, but he never had his business plan together. So it ended up in mountains around our house. So I'd look out the window and I'd see tomatoes the size of some grapefruits as a natural phenomena. It wasn't until I began to leave home and began to realize tomatoes weren't this size. And everyone did not have compost all around their house. And the mayor's wife started laughing. I said, what's going on? See that guy over there? He's just as weird. We have compost everywhere. I said, I thought he was the mayor. No, no, no. He runs a major compost business. Mayor doesn't pay too well in China. Compost business pays much better. And I said, well, you know, Dad used to do a strange thing. He used to take the coal and remediate some of those cadmiums and mercuries and stuff out of it and realize that they're all the trace elements that you need to put into the compost to make it a real organic fertilizer. And that just maybe you could get that coal and actually add it, bioremediate it, and add it into your compost to make a really rich way of operating on the land. So the mayor comes over, high-fives. I said, whoa, now I'm in trouble. Did I know how to do this? Not exactly. Did I write a paper on this and did I present it to the network of my peers at a conference? Absolutely. Did anything happen? Nothing. Until 2 years later, got a call from London. Did you do this paper? Yeah. You did this comparison of what the organic farmers call green sand and what's in coal, and there's much more in coal. That paper you did? Yeah, did that paper. Wow. We're in the business of converting coal to fertilizer. Where are you calling from? London. He said, well, do you want to get into business doing this stuff? I said, could be. What do you got? And so in the next week, that much intellectual property came. FedExed, London. Derived originally from Pennsylvania. Photographs comparing this. So I began to say, wow, just think if coal, by some superior being in the universe, was put here to actually not be burned. and maybe to be part of an entire global rehabilitation system for our soils. Absurd. So here these guys were doing it. Global patents. Do they bioremediating properly, getting all those cadmiums out, mercuries out? No. Did I try to connect them to all the people that I knew that maybe be able to take care of that? Yes. Did they do it yet? They're seriously considering it, because putting cadmium and mercury onto your farm is not exactly the future. Is there a possibility? Major possibility. So that is one. Saltwater wetlands. Here we are in the Baja, designing a little campus for college students to come and learn how to live with the ecology of nature on the Baja Peninsula. Looking straight at Magdalena Bay, all the whales giving birth. That's their living room window. And so I began to look at several things. I began to say, you know, it's a flood zone. Doing compost privies and so on is not exactly what you call a good floodable technique. Wonder how crazy it would be to pump the water 16 feet under our feet to at least flush the commodes and take the wastewater and put it into a saltwater wastewater wetland. Doesn't take a PhD to think this way. And how relevant that would be to these students learning the ecology of a coastal zone that is losing rapidly their wetlands. So I'm creating wetlands as my landscape in a learning environment by doing the outrageous thing of just, in a very simple manner, pumping the water up 16 feet and flushing with it and putting it into a saltwater wetland. Client says, no way. Why? Find me an example. Then I'll do it. And I had thought I had lost the first round in doing this, so I wasn't very happy that I was put to the task of finding this stuff, which I frankly had never heard of. Never heard of this in my entire life. The first task, by the way, was the phenomenon of where you're going to get fresh water. So in this case, we began to look at fog, because I come out one morning from the place we're staying, and every single morning, desert environment, 2 inches of rainfall, I collect half a cup of water in my teacup. That little ridge above the tire. I say, wow, did you ever look at this? They said, what do you mean, look at this? I said, catch the fog. Well, there's some crazy insects around here. They catch the fog underneath their wings and do wild things, but we're humans. We don't do that kind of thing. Really? So it's a fairly obvious thing to me. I mean, we could design an entire little campus that would really be meaningful with the potable water being collected by the fog, no pumping of the water. By the way, the aquifer and the pumping distance, 54 miles. Ecological campus. Pathetic situation. Now, if you don't ask the questions, nothing happens. So there I am in Austin, sitting on the couch. Planet Earth comes on. Who's on planet Earth? The fog-catching expert for the UN. I say, whoa, you know, what's happening here? How can I come home and within one day the fog-catching expert is sitting on the radio? He's going through all the basic relationships. You need this much screen. These are the areas in the world where it's good. This is how much water you get. And I'm writing down madly. gives his name, gives his research institute in Canada, immediately get a hold of them, loads of information. Where is their project? 25 miles from our site in the Baja. So it's a very interesting situation, the meta. Do you know how much of the world's population sits on coastal areas? Depends on what part of the world that you're in, but up to 30%. What are they doing? Never would they dream of taking their sewage, treating it, and creating wetlands. And yet, wetlands are disappearing in every direction. No, nor would they ever dream of going and taking that salt water and making a saltwater sewage system, because they haven't connected to the fact that, first of all, that's even possible. Secondly, it involves a different way of thinking about plumbing. It involves a different commode. It involves all sorts of things. And the client asked me, where does the toilet come from? I said, well, it's a typical situation. Let's walk down, you go down the main street, this little Baja community. And if I go right, I go to the plumbing store. If I go left, I go to the marine store. The marine store has all the commodes, all the techniques for use in all the ships and all the boats, low water, all the salt-tolerant gaskets, this, that, and the other thing, done. So I said to the client, it's a typical thing. You walk one way, you get nothing. You walk the other way, you get a different view of the world. Pint and a half flush, water conserving, as if you have to conserve salt water. Wetlands that could easily be done. Now, there are some problems in all these things. Shit floats in salt water. It's a little bit embarrassing at first. You begin to realize that shit does float in salt water. So you begin to have to get an unusual set of engineers to even cope with this, because they have to make sure the shit gets into the water enough, long enough, that it processes, and there are different microbes, and there's different time retention, different this and different that, but I could not find a single example with all my gurus in the guru friends in the wastewater field that had ever looked at a saltwater, wastewater, wetland system. I finally found one engineer to stamp the whole thing. So meta systems, anybody can begin to think in this way. You sort of look and you think, and you begin to realize that there is another major world that you have to enter, and solutions have got to happen. Next. Is it the end? It's 2 o'clock. Damn, I was just getting going. Are there any more of these? Oh, good. Let's try another one. They're all so captivated that they possibly will not leave, will they? Is this at all interesting to anybody here? Oh, good. I see 3 heads shaking. Okay. Okay. Feedback City. So now there's a particular problem in our work, because we have to be super adaptable. We've worked with 7 Indian nations in the U.S. We've worked with Indian nations in Central and South America. This is a different phenomena than working and creating the first green building program in the world with Austin, Texas. You don't use the same language. You don't use the same techniques. You don't use tools that are the same. So we started making what we call this ladder. And I don't know whether anybody can see this. The development ladder. And the development ladder begins to say that you are dealing with different, totally different relationships of humans to their environment. And unless you absorb this, you're not going to connect. So a sapient society is a society that is so plugged in to its place, to all the cycles of life, all the air, all the water, all the food, all the materials, all these things are directly part of their system. The only problem is that they are in the midst of being in a major force environment. They're being forced out. Because so-called advanced cultures come along and say, we want to use your stuff, which are usually minerals, or in the case of one situation, working with the Mosquito Indians on the east coast of Nicaragua, in the middle of a revolution, their soils for bananas. So the entire savanna is wiped out for bananas. So what do? What vestiges are sitting there that you can work with that can at least keep a basis going that works with nature, that becomes powerful enough to counteract the banana folks? What's the big banana company? What is it? Dole. It was the Dole guys. But the Sandinistas, the revolutionary government that was coming in, that was being forced to do something with the Mosquito Indians because they were the revolutionaries against the revolutionaries. And I was stuck right in between. I was coming from the U.S., being guarded with AK-47s from who? My government. Do you guys live any kind of adventuresome life at all around here? I mean, do you want to get into adventure? Mix it up. Go and join different situations. Begin to learn things that you normally might never learn. So we began to look at all the resources in the region, and we began to get some of the businesses, some of the skills being brought to the point of importance in a housing project funded by the Sandinistas, picking up money out of Europe because I couldn't get money from the U.S. So this money came from Ireland, this money came from all kinds of different places. And so I tried to say, all right, how do I not make them reactionary and revolutionary? How can I get them accepting some things, beginning to move up this ladder to anticipatory and worldly and systemic and evolutionary and mimemic without destroying their culture? So when we did Austin, I borrowed from a systems thinking way of doing things. Never told them for a long time. Because the entire Austin Green Building Program came out of a systems view of the world that I was very lucky to be exposed to in school. In a very unusual place called the Business School at the University of Pennsylvania. In a class in operations research that started out looking at all the different systems thinking ways of dealing with the world. And one was cybernetics. the relationship of people to machine and the feedback. And I read this little book called Design for a Brain. And Design for a Brain actually came up, I thought, with a model that would be perfect for a city. Feedback, Ross Ashby. The environment, the organism trying to learn from each other and evolve. It became the city and its commissions. It became the private sector trying to communicate back and forth to the city. It became all these commissions with their feedback loop and their sensors saying, hey, we're in trouble with the water. Now, does this relate to you in Muncie, Indiana? Good question. Don't know. As was brought up this morning, I guess Austin, Texas is just so special that they do these things and no other town will do them. But it is interesting. When we created this, within 5 years, 30 cities. Did the same thing with the state architecture and engineering guidelines. 20 to 30 states. LEED, the U.S. Green Building Council, attributes us to actually coming up with the first way of understanding rating systems at the scale of a city. And out of this very simple realization of you cannot take this and mix it with that, and you've got to begin to work at that level of feedback at a city level and develop rating systems that actually help the operations of that city over the long term, it won the only Earth Summit award given to the U.S. But you can't do this kind of thing because you're not Austin, Texas. But just maybe it would be interesting that feedback about that river and how that's a corridor and how that's a spine begins perhaps to be a slightly different model. Because everything that happens with all the water and the air and the sewage and the materials and the agriculture and the chemicals and all these things go where? Right into the river. So could you adapt this kind of thing and say maybe that's your way of thinking about this entire corridor? And as we go down the corridor and when we review it with John and I, excuse me, in a moment, you'll begin to see different kinds of feedback going up and down this river. Different ways of stabilizing. So we're ready? Yep. Now I have lots of others that at some point, someday, maybe I'll share. Maybe I get invited back someday. We'll work on it. Well, you know, questions would be kind of interesting. Does anybody, you know, by the way, there's no such thing as a stupid question. I ask stupid questions all my life. Look how much trouble I've gotten myself into.
Questions, anybody? I can bring you the mic so we can put it on the record. Going one.
John. No questions. That means you understand everything. And that you're just going to connect and do these unbelievable, rethink of these lenses, rethink of overlay, create your own lens. Wow. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, my question is, and it relates to the question that came up this morning in terms of Austin being somehow different. I grew up in Austin, and I left Austin about the time that the center really emerged. And Austin, before the center emerged, was much like Muncie in the sense of what its aspirations were. And there was a period of time over about 10 or 15 years where the city changed the way it thought profoundly. And I wonder if you might have any insights, having been there, having lived through that, of what causes that kind of an emergence to occur.
Great question. So one of the things that became very, very apparent is that to move things, you do not do it yourself. You begin to collect every simple smidgen of an example that's out there. And you train your mind and you train your visualization techniques to say, hey, there are always interesting things going on. Now, they might be very simple at first. There's actually a business that is totally dependent on water conservation. At a point, I might add, when water conservation wasn't nearly what it is now. And that business was successful enough that it began to get into the energy and water conservation business. The camaraderie that began to happen, triggered by a community of people that began to get to know each other and help each other. I'll never forget, I'm coming down an elevator. We lost a contract. And so I'm talking to Chris Strand, and he just won a, $800,000 contract for all government buildings to conserve water. And I said, have you heard of this particular way of doing this? Just elevator talk. No, never heard of that. Hey, maybe we could partner. And I really needed this job. So right there in the elevator, we partnered. I saved him $80,000. I made for me $20,000. And what was beginning to happen was the first inclination of, you know something? We ought to all get together. Create a force. Begin to say, this green building program really means, the green building program was not quite there yet, but there was talk. So when we came up and actually proposed such a thing, there was enough talk and enough commotion beginning to happen at the grassroots level, it was almost inevitable. Now, one of the things that does worry me a little bit is that here you have a university that is a very robust university in Austin, Texas. Lots of departments, lots of good things going on. But people do not always like to relate to a university. It's a little bit elitist. No matter what university it is. And the most important thing that we began to do is to break out of that university context, create a business, be able to ask questions ourselves, because we began to get a little tiny bit of funding. This isn't snap of the finger and all of a sudden you got $250,000 in the bank. This is that network saying, those guys are doing interesting stuff. Maybe this foundation down in Houston, Texas, who is, by the way, a most unlikely foundation to be interested in what we're doing, called the de Menil Foundation, which basically funds the arts. But for some reason, Mrs. de Menil funded Renzo Piano, a very well-known architect, to do her museum, and said, you know something? I'm going to fund you a little bit. I'm talking about a little bit. This was about $12,000 for about 3 years. enough to get somebody sitting in the front office. That's what started it out. And now we had a group of people that we could actually work with at the grassroots level that we'd seek out and find, began to meet every first Tuesday of the month over coffee and pizza and say, you know, we can get the next level of this thing going. We can get the city to really respect us. And when this competition possibility came along, and by the way, again, not a lot of money. Urban Consortium had an RFQ out, request for qualifications. Washington, D.C., does anybody have any ideas of the city of the future? Bam! Got together with Austin, got together with our network, put this thing in, got $10,000 to create the first green building program in the world. So this is not some flash in the pan, cool idea. It is networked, connected, public, private, partnerships, informally, not some great big, you know, I've got a $500,000 grant to bring all this together. You sort of begin to do it. Does that answer? A little bit?
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think probably what we should do, given the time here, is move into the next part of the afternoon, which is John's going to kind of walk you through that. So let's give Pliny a hand, and we'll see you tonight at 5. If you're staying on for the studios, whether you're students or reviewers or whatever, please hang in there. Pliny's next lecture formally will be about his office. It starts at 5 o'clock. There'll be a reception afterwards.
Thanks, folks, for even sticking around. But you know, I'm going to say one little tiny thing for a moment. And I mentioned this morning, a book by the name of Blink that a few people have read, and that is, you just got into your head much more than you think you did. All we have to do is create a situation for recall pretty soon. Otherwise, it does disappear.
Okay, what Pliny just said is you have more in your head, I think is really true. Pliny and I share some experience, like study with a guy named Ian McHarg. Ian actually closed a lecture once with a very similar kind of a talk, and it was because we were quite frustrated as his students about the complexity, and his comment was that it is overpowering. You don't think you know anything. You think you're just hearing a lot and trying to repeat it or somehow pull it together. But he said, you're going to wake up one day, or you're going to suddenly realize in 3 or 4 years that you see something differently than you'd have ever seen it otherwise. And you'll realize that what you're experiencing is its value. Because the value of these kinds of experiences, I think, aren't what you walk away with immediately. That it's back in the subconscious. It's when you're about to go to sleep or waking up in the morning, when you're not rationally thinking, the mind begins to make connections. Is Allie here? Allie Hubert? Allie Hubert, there she is. About a year ago when she came back from Hawaii, she said, I asked her what she learned from their time at the permaculture area, and she said one of the things that surprised her the most is what I asked, was the use, what a hammock is for. And I asked, well, what does that mean? And she says, well, you take a hammock out to the field, you work, and then in the heat of the day, you hang your hammock and you lay down. And as you're drowsing, as you're relaxing, when you wake up, you nap off, you wake up, whatever,
Good.
and you begin to see
do you
things
like with it?
that you did a year ago or 2 years ago. And you see that certain things you did worked really well over there and they don't work over here. It was a way of saying you're open to feedback. I think all of these kind of experiences is to put you into a different kind of a situation to where perhaps that feedback can happen. Now, Pliny talked about various lenses, and you may or may not be making connections yet. But I think we will over this week, and I think there'll be really deep connections. I hope so. What I'd like to do is just a little bit begin to transition from the lenses to talking about the river. And I must back up a little bit and say when Pliny was talking about the water quality issues having to do with things like CSOs, which we don't generally have in Texas because our cities were built post-World War II, there are major issues associated with what was the way we built the world in a previous point in history, that we no longer build the world that way. But infrastructure has a funny thing. It sits around for hundreds of years. And so the CSO problems that Muncie has today are problems that came from how Muncie did business a century ago, not necessarily what we're doing now. And I'd also second like to set the stage by saying I think this week is all about that, what was that one last lens you talked about, Pliny, the feedback city? The feedback city talks about how emergence occurs in emerging from one vision to a whole different kind of a vision. This is what we're talking about, I think, by the river. And we're very, very fortunate because I didn't think he would be here today, but we have a guy named John Craddock who's in the back of the audience, who in the 70s, in a similar kind of a version, had almost a feedback city approach because he envisioned that the White River had a potential. And that potential was more than a chemical sewer for the automobile industry. And it's very hard to effect change that takes a whole community to another level, but that's what happened in the White River in the 70s. Before that, for decades and decades before that, the city marketed itself as free energy and free sewage. And the free sewage tended to be the White River. And industries were allowed to dump in the White River. And in the 70s, that changed. And the river in the 70s, within a period of a decade or more, evolved from a degenerating river into a regenerating river. Now, the CSOs are still there, and when it rains and when the sewer system gets overflooded, that creates a temporary problem in terms of organics in the water, etc. But I think that very much as the chemical issues associated with the river in the 70s, we're at a period in history now where maybe perhaps since EPA has hammers hanging over the head in Muncie and Indianapolis and all the cities around the country that have CSO problems, tending to be the cities that were built 100 years ago, all those cities are facing a problem kind of like the one Pliny was talking about with the Metamax, saltwater sewage. How do you deal with saltwater sewage? Well, how do you deal with CSOs when the community's built all around them? And so these lenses or ways of thinking that think far beyond what we normally think of on a day-to-day basis, I think are the ways that the seeds are going to be planted, the passion's going to occur, that 40 years from now, the river is going to be a profoundly different place, and Muncie's going to be a profoundly different place because we were able to take those visions. Now, what I want to do very quickly is talk about the river in a very, very cursory sense and realizing that there are a lot of people in this audience, certainly John and Les and Phil Tevis, that know the river far better than I know. Hi, Phil. How you doing? But what I'd like to do is very quickly is just talk about some of the differences that I think I see along the river, which you may see something very, very different. But these differences, I'm going to talk about kind of my cognitive map of the river based upon what I think I see. For instance, there's an area of the river from, say, the Craddock wetland, the upper stretches of the river in Muncie, that seems to be an area of the river that is kind of hard to find the river. And the community tends to back up to the river and turned its back on the river because the community was growing at a time that river was not necessarily seen as a visual or an amenity resource. That might coincide with that period of when, the river was a sewer, and therefore you backed up to it. You didn't open up to it. And there are other places along the river, like much of downtown, that has remnant communities that back up to the river, but not in a way that display the river or that present it as the potential it has. And if you look at, on the other hand, a very different portion of the river is the portion from Craddock Wetlands, say, to McCullough Park. Because when you drive that road along the river, you're kind of moving with the river. The river is a part of your visual corridor. It's not the edge, but rather the edge is beyond. The river becomes part of this experience of the landscape. And it's interesting that that's a section of the river that's really changed profoundly in the last 15 years. So there are these different zones. There's a zone around Minnetrista where the public doesn't contact the river, doesn't see the river if you're in your automobile. There's a wonderful bike path and hiking ways, etc. But if you're talking about in terms of driving through town on a day-to-day basis, you're disconnected from the river for a while. And of course, there's the front door into the downtown, as well as the east front door into the downtown, that have tremendous potentials. That in terms of, and I back up to something I told the group yesterday in terms of a conference I went to in 1970 in Dallas, the river and the city, and the basic message of the conference was, what's the difference between good cities and really great cities? And the message I walked away from the conference with was, really great cities deal with their water resource profoundly different than other cities do. And I would extend that to their resources in general, and certainly in river cities like Muncie, the river is perhaps the resource, or one of the resources with the greatest potential. So the degree to which we maximize the potential of the White River, in some degrees, is going to be the degree to which we're a great city 40 years from now. You've got then this whole zone of the river, like where we were yesterday at West Side Park, which we found out used to be an amusement park, West Side Park, and before that was back in the 1915 or whatever, about the time of the Great Flood, I guess, was one of 7,000 war gardens in the city. And then, of course, this whole zone, this west end of the river, is the zone where I believe most of the CSO outfalls occur, so that when it rains, that flushing of the wastewater is a real issue. And then, of course, the Muncie Sanitary District, the major sewage treatment plant there, and the recent development of the White River greenway is progressing through stages, beginning, I guess, really here at the Craddock Wetland and this section into the next generation of what the river is going to be. And certainly, as you go through the river and deal with the various zones of the river, for the next day, you're going to be taking the lens, looking at the river as a whole. Then Tuesday afternoon, we're going to start looking at pieces of the river as well as the whole. But look at for the next day, as you're focusing on your individual lenses, look at the river as a whole through that lens that you happen to be working with. And also look at it as a series of events or as a structure within that whole based upon that lens. And what we may see whenever we begin to put these lenses together Tuesday and Wednesday, there may be a totally different structure of what's happening in the river than the one I just did, because the one I just did was really kind of informed by a windshield survey as I drove through the city. It wasn't informed by these maps. John, Phil, Les, anything anyone wants to say about the river that the whole group needs to hear that's really quite essential? This is John Craddock, who created the Muncie Sanitary District and was responsible for good things in the river.
Just to give you a five-second history so that you don't think that our river is just a total open sewer like some towns still have, and most of you are probably from out of town. So I'm just going to give you a quick minute or two so that you can see what has been done. Is this a community that cares about its river? The answer is yes. Is this a community that many of its citizens know more about its river than many towns? And the answer is yes, because there's been over 500 newspaper articles and over 25% have been on the front page. In 1972, when we started the Bureau of Water Quality, which is like a miniature EPA to work on the river, and it's locally funded, where you can pay your sewage bill, we get a small portion of it. Our staff are all chemists, biologists, bacteriologists, aquatic entomologists, fisheries biologists. So that's the type of staff that we have. And there's 13 of us, and that's for a town this size. And it's a regulatory agency. But we didn't stop there. We made it a holistic approach. So also wildlife habitat restoration, recreational development, all those type of things. So therefore, high use of the College of Architects, for instance. We've shot through 170 interns through our department, through various colleges over here at Ball State. So all of our students have at least one of their degrees from Ball State. But here's what you need to remember. When you're out there working, designing, thinking about economic uses, thinking about ecological uses of variety, in 1970 we had 30 species of fish out here. Now we have over 65 species because of the pollutants that have been removed. We had aquatic insects we basically did not have within the city limits. We had tubiflex worms and those type of things. Now we have over 170 aquatic insects, of which over 70% are clean water species. We have freshwater mussels out there that we didn't have. We have bike trails we didn't used to have. The bottom of the stream used to be 2 feet of industrial waste and sewage muck. Now it's all bedrock or sand and gravel. Most of the toxins, such as your total toxic organics, your heavy metals, have been removed. We still have CSOs we're working on. The Sanitary Board just passed a $160 million 20-year project to remove those to have zero discharge. So that's what's going to be going on over the next 20 years. Then the College of Architects, people like Flatlands, Phil Tevis, a variety of people have gotten together, the Plan Commission, Marta Moody, City of Muncie Sanitary District, a bunch of people have come together. And now we have 5 overlooks on our river because now it's something pleasant to look at. It's not perfect, but giant steps. We now have a bike path along the river. We now have wetlands that are being developed. We have brownfields along the river that are being cleaned up. So what I'm trying to leave you with is just that we are not starting from zero. You are not starting with a community that doesn't care and doesn't have an education in this area. There has been 40 years of hard work to get us to where we are now.
Thank you very much, John. While we have everyone here, I also want to talk about another dimension of Design Week that we haven't mentioned enough to you yet, and that's that we will have real experts on these issues with us over the course of the week. And I want to acknowledge a few of those, and whoever I leave out as one of our resource people, somebody holler at me, please, because I don't want to omit. Of course, you all know Les Smith, who's been involved with design build projects with our students along the river for a number of years. Sitting right to his right, your left, is Phil Tevis. Flatland Resources, Phil has been doing the projects along the White River, including Craddock Wetlands and other projects. Phil, I think, has slides of the river, and we've got this room all afternoon in addition to the workshop area where we'll be working, and so you might be able to corral Phil or Colby Gray, who is also with Flatland. Colby graduated and, by the way, did some really interesting eco-balance design in Meg's class a few years back when he was a student here. So there's a connection to the process that we're doing. On Phil's left, Phil's right, your left, is Jason Donati. For those of you who are into you all know Les. Phil, would you stand up in the gray? Phil Tevis, Jason Donati in the green shirt, and Colby Gray in the front. Thank you. Jason is he's with Stormwater Management, and then in his other hours, he's a local food person. The name of the local food group is Oogie, Urban Gardening Initiative. And so he will be around if you're interested in that whole local food dimension or water issues associated with the river. He's a real resource. Over in the far corner of the room, back corner, we have your former department chair, Dave Ferguson, who was chair here through the early 90s. Some of you may recognize Dave. He now runs the Center for Media Design. Shows that the skills of landscape architects are often appreciated far beyond our discipline. Dave finds it, I think, very hard to justify spending a whole lot of time in this building when he's responsible for so many other things at the university. But he's been able to carve out a big chunk of his week this week to spend time with you as well. And among the things that Dave did when he was chair and when he was here as a faculty member for years, he was very much focused on CSOs and was I think one of the last things he was doing in the department was had a major proposal out to capture some funds to do some CSO transformation kind of wetland work. So what other resource people do we have here that I haven't seen? Okay, so you'll have these people. Warren Vanderhill, former provost of the university, will be spending time with us this week. John Craddock will be in for reviews. We'll have people from other departments for reviews. We'll also have regulators, practitioners. We'll have a panel here on Wednesday from 3:30 to 5 with regulators and visionary landscape architects and hydrologists, so that we can begin to explore the issues that you raise in the work that you're doing over the course of this week issues that have to do with, what's the real potential of a river? What do we do to realize that potential or to make it harder to achieve that potential in terms of how we manage, how we regulate, how we envision futures for rivers? Is that it? Okay, so we have kind of a bifocal vision this afternoon. Let's head back over to the workshop area. There are 11 areas, double tables, 11 groupings. The number on the table corresponds with the number of your group. And what you need to do very quickly is go back there and form your group, all 11 of you, and identify within the group what person is going to be focused on what lens, because we're, in about 15 minutes, going to reconstitute ourselves into the lens teams and start working on the lenses. No, the tables, okay, the teams that you're in now, as I indicated yesterday, for those of you who are at the river and may have heard, the teams that you formed already are the teams for the week. The other teams you're going to come back and work with tomorrow, Tuesday. We formed those final teams to begin with because that's your team for the project. But to get the expertise in all this complexity, rather than each of you having to develop ideas about 11 lenses, each of which is new to you, for the first day, you're going to take one person from each of your teams. So if you're team one of the people will be doing eco-balance. Another person from that team will be doing Metamax. Another person will be doing Minimax. Another team will be doing Protoscope. And so then by noon tomorrow, we'll reconstitute the team until it'll be a team of 11 with each of those people a one-day expert, sketch problem, and quick expert on that particular lens. When you reconstitute, or whenever you identify within your teams, we can then say, okay, now this lens, table number 1, is going to become this lens. Everyone that's working on Protoscope, go to table 1. Everyone that's working on EcoBalance, go to table 2. And for then the next 24 hours, that team will be table 1, table 2, and then on Tuesday, the original team 1 will get back on table 1. Okay? Very good questions, Carla. Thank you.